We are recording. I'm here with Philip. How are you doing today, Philip?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Excellent. So, you popped into my feed and I checked out some of the things you were saying. You had mentioned, or we had both discussed, Europe and maybe the failures of Europe, as opposed to, relatively speaking, China and America.
Mm.
Specifically, maybe with regard to AI, innovation, technology. So, give me kind of an elevator pitch. Why has Europe maybe fallen behind where it was historically, say from 1500 to I don't know when you'd say that 1945. When do
Yeah.
you think, maybe that's a more specific question rather than open ended one? Um, when do you think that um, obviously we could it's a quantitative problem to ask when did America overtake Europe, but when do you place that date, and when do you think that occurred, and do you think that problem, like the problems that Europe faces today, are these new recent problems, or are these like stretching back 100 years or even more? Where do you
Mm.
place this divergence or overtaking having occurred?
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. You can look at this in two ways. On the one hand, it's not that Europe is doing very badly, and that Europe is declining in absolute terms, at least not in all areas or in most areas, and the US is going the other way and Europe is going down. It's more so that the US has kept growing and growing, and especially for an advanced economy, and most countries in Europe have sort of stagnated, or the growth has been slowing down over time, growth in terms of GDP and all of these other metrics. And I would say that probably, I think the divergence probably started sometime, or became more pronounced sometime like 20 to 30 years ago. Um, Coincides a lot with, I think, on the one hand, the IT sort of tech boom, the .com stuff. Europe kind of had these big telecom companies, and we had, or we still have, Nokia and Ericsson, but those are kind of old dinosaur companies now. And then the US came along with Apple and Amazon and all of those companies, and they just completely overtook most other European companies in that sector. So in a sense, uh, Europe is sort of like a 19th century economy in many ways. The US is like a 20th century economy. And we'll see how it does going forward. Um, yeah, there's a lot more to say there. I think another thing is that Europe is also obviously not one country. Um, I would say maybe the US is also not one country in some sense, given that it's so big and there are 50 states, and at the very least you could say that you have like West Coast and California and the East Coast, and then in the middle or the South. Um, but in any case, Europe really is several different countries. The EU, for all its trying, is still a patchwork of different countries that try to agree on a bunch of different things. So, sort of one of the conclusions that I've come to reading a lot about this in the recent past is that it is both a strength, for Europe, that it has that it that it's based on all of these different countries and cultures, but it's also a big weakness, especially in economic terms. A company that wants to grow, a startup that starts in the US, gets some VC funding, and wants to grow, instantly has access to a market of like 300 million plus people, even more if you consider Canada, and so on. and even more if you then go over to like the UK. But definitely 300 or 50 million or so in the US. A European company, a Swedish company, for example, although the European market contains like 450 million people, many of them speak different languages. They have different cultures, different regulatory regimes, bureaucratic processes, and all of these different things. So it's very fragmented. And that just means that it is not as straightforward to grow a company. And I think that really puts a cap on the growth trajectory of many companies. It also indirectly puts a cap on the amount of capital that is available to startup companies and companies in general in Europe. And so I think it all kind of comes back to the fragmentation in many ways.
Yeah, this is interesting because, my understanding was that the European Union was maybe overzealously, or this was, from an English speaking perspective, we're presented with a view of the European Union that's maybe influenced more by Brexit and those sort of arguments that, the Europeans, they're trying to regulate the size of a banana and they're forcing everybody have the same bananas. And there's no, this was the kind of rhetoric coming out of Brexit. And so I just kind of assumed that the European, first of all, there's a common currency, which is, probably the first and foremost, most important thing if you want to have a common unified market, have a common currency. And then I just assumed like, okay, I'm hearing about all these banana controversies. So whether that's, right or wrong or whatever, people are in Greece complained about this, for example, that there were these austerity measures being imposed. And so I just kind of assumed that Europe was doing the best it could to form a unified economic policy because it was encountering all this pushback in Greece, all this pushback in Britain. And so I assumed like they're really pushing the limits. Like if they go any further, you might actually have states start to leave the European Union, which is not what you want. You want, basically in terms of a long-term strategy, you want states to stay within the European Union. You want them to slowly, boil the frog, you coax them into this situation where eventually they adopt all these. And actually in America, we have very similar strategies, maybe not for economic policy because we've resolved most of those regulatory, not all of them. Healthcare, for example, we don't have a national healthcare system. It is state versus state, which is an unfortunate fact. Reduces competition. So we probably have a worse healthcare system than most European countries for that fact. But putting that aside, I assume that the Europeans are doing the best that they can, given maybe the political situation, the fact that there is so much Euroscepticism, not everywhere, obviously, but among kind of, you could say, the periphery of Europe. And so it's a balancing act of, do you want the European Union to consolidate and expand so that it just has the largest market possible? Or do you kind of say, well, if Greece doesn't want to be part of it, or something like that, if Britain doesn't want to be part of it, that's okay. What we need to do is consolidate and maybe have a smaller European Union that's maybe more German-centric, but it's going to be more unified on policy, and therefore we're going to cut down these bureaucratic differences and regulations, which is going to allow Europe to, have something equivalent to Google or Apple or some kind of big innovative tech company. Do you think those are mutually exclusive options? Do you think there's a third option where you can have the best of both worlds? What do you think of those strategies?
Yeah, there is this at the core of it, it's a tension between decentralization and centralization, and it's really the same tension that you find in the U.S. as well in many ways. There's always been like these cessationist impulses in some states, and obviously the U.S. hasn't been all of the 50 states for that long. And there are forces within Europe. You mentioned it, like basically the closer you come to the center of Western Europe, at least, like Germany, Belgium, France, etc. That's like the hardcore of the EU. and then the further out you go in the periphery, the less euro friendly the countries are. To an extent, I think it varies. There's also another divide. You have basically like the southern parts of Europe, which are in many ways more of a drag on the EU. I'm sort of using the EU and Europe interchangeably, but I'll try to clarify if I mean something different. Um, but yeah, I mean Spain, Portugal, Italy is one of the biggest economies in the world, but it's not. I'm not sure that it's like a net contributor to the EU in terms of the economy. Obviously, Greece is a prominent example, and then you have some of the newer Eastern European countries that came in. So it's really like Germany, France, the Netherlands, and the Nordic countries, except for Norway, which isn't in the EU, that are sort of the drivers, or at least the fastest growing economies and the net contributors to the union. So there's a tension there as well. Where so I'm from Sweden. I live in Stockholm, and a lot of people in Sweden feel like we're paying a lot of money to our taxes. Part of our taxes go to the EU. It's not a federation, so it's not like how Californians pay taxes to the federal government in the US, but still we pay something, and I think even more than paying, we are also um, when the EU comes out with new laws and directives and so on, we have to abide by them to an extent. It depends on what it is. It's that tension, and basically, the further out you go, the harder it is for people to agree. And then you mentioned these things like with the cucumbers and the bananas and over regulating stuff. Uh, I've always found that ridiculous. I think there's like a grain of truth to it. It's also been exaggerated a lot. But like with all of these sort of rules and bureaucracies, there is there's like a good reason for it somewhere there in the beginning, but it's kind of been lost. But I think that's also emblematic of a lot of the problems that ail Europe in terms of sort of the union excelling at making laws and regulating things and not much else, right? So you sort of want the union to be a force for what I talked about before, about basically providing individuals and companies and countries with a bigger market, more opportunities for growth and for creating wealth and security. That's another topic we can discuss. And instead, in many ways, it hasn't, maybe it's wrong to say that it makes it harder, but it certainly hasn't lived up to its promise of economic unification. So one example is the euro, the common currency, which, for example, in Sweden, we don't have the euro, we still have the Swedish crown. And right now, the Swedish crown is very weak. The euro is much stronger, the US dollar is much stronger. So for an average Swedish citizen going abroad, anywhere in the US or the Europe is very expensive. On the other hand, that makes it easier for us to export and so on, and we can control our currency a bit better. In the euro crisis and after the financial crisis, a lot of European countries that were in the euro had a lot of problems because, again, in some ways, they have a common currency, but the European Central Bank doesn't have all of the powers, like the fiscal powers and so on, to sort of to do what regular central banks can do in their own countries in terms of printing money and controlling the interest rates and having that apply equally across all countries or individually in good ways in all countries. So it's sort of like the point I'm getting to is that in some ways, the European Union and the economic cooperation is sort of too heavy-handed, but also not heavy-handed enough or not centralized enough. So we're sort of stuck in a bad compromise in many ways.
It sounds like what you're saying to me is that oftentimes the regulation is too specific, but not broad enough, so that It's trying to micromanage issues that maybe don't matter and that are politically aggravating to people, but it's not taking care of these big abstract things that maybe the average person probably doesn't even understand. Like, in America, we have this huge national debt that, to some extent is a product of Federal Reserve policy. Um, and, the average person is maybe vaguely aware of that, but it's not as politically charged as some specific, like, they don't necessarily, when they go to the gas pump and they see gas prices, or they go to the grocery store and they see the price of eggs, they don't think, the Federal Reserve and they're printing money and this is the problem. They generally think, oh, it's these greedy corporations, or it's the politicians, or maybe it's the fault of socialism, or whatever. But they don't usually connect those two things together. So I'm not sure what I guess what those. So to create change within Europe, so you put out a number of different sort of prescriptions of what direction you think Europe should move toward. You say things like you'd like to see English made into the continental language, or the lingua franca. You say that you'd like perhaps to invite, you'd like to have more high-skilled immigration. I think Europe is kind of infamous at this point for having low-skilled immigration. That is the majority, and I don't know if it has been changing at all, but since 2014, overwhelmingly the number of immigrants coming to Europe have been refugees, or have had some sort of refugee status or claim. So switching that around, changing the way that you fund education, changing the way that you do regulation. So all of these different policies, some of them would require probably more political capital than others. Some of them would be more difficult than others. But is there, in terms of practical reality, I mean, maybe we could agree that some of these things would be ideally good. But what is the actual mechanism? Is it electing, like there's a European Parliament, and so then what you would have to do is you would be in Sweden and you would go to your fellow Swedes and you'd say, hey, we need to elect members to the European Parliament who support these positions. And if the Germans do the same and the French do the same, we all, in our own individual countries, we elect these members to Parliament, then they can vote for these reforms. So is it purely a democratic mechanism, or do you feel like there's an opportunity, like in America, we have a lot of lobbying industries who, rather than going to like the average person and saying, you need to vote for this issue, you just go straight to the politicians and you say, here's why you need to support this issue, and you need to kind of convince the voters on, like, retroactively, like after you pass the law, then you can convince the voters of why it was a good idea. We also have, of course, the president can do executive orders. I don't think there's a European president who can do executive orders. We also have a Supreme Court that people criticize because oftentimes they'll issue a ruling that is in effect a law. For instance, our abortion law is basically controlled by the Supreme Court. Our laws concerning presidential immunity, laws concerning segregation. I mean, there's a lot of laws that basically have been determined not by the legislature or the president, but by the Supreme Court. So we have those kind of ways to get around democracy that are sort of expedient, depending on your view, for good or evil. But it doesn't seem like Europe has those. So I guess the question I'm asking is, do you think it would be easier to work within the current parliamentary framework provided by the European Union in order to push these issues? Or do you think it's better to conduct some kind of structural reform of how policy, legislation, regulation is formed, either by creating like new branches of government, like there should be a stronger European president, or there should be a stronger European Supreme Court. And by doing those structural reforms, then it will be easier to push these policies through, because there's just too much parliamentary gridlock right now for any of these things to happen? Or do you think, both of them should occur at the same time, or maybe there's a third option?
Yeah. it goes back a little bit to this tension between centralization and decentralization as well, in that, you can imagine a future where the EU becomes power becomes more centralized, or at least the EU as an institution, the institutions within the EU get more power over the individual member countries, and at some point it becomes more like a federation. It has various things that kind of make it into a federation, but also many things that makes it not a federation. I mean, like the amount of money, as I said before, that European countries pay into the EU is minuscule. It's basically only to run the EU bureaucracy, which is it's like 100 billion euros or something, or maybe more. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to the total size of the European economy, which is actually, I think that's a misconception that a lot of people, like anti-EU people, have across the world or across Europe, that we're paying all of this money to the EU, and when reality is not. However, that's not to say that the EU isn't efficient enough or anything like that, but it's an important point. Regarding the democracy stuff, the EU also has an executive branch, a judicial branch, and what's the third one?
Well, the legislature,
The
parliament.
the parliament, exactly, the parliament. So in the EU, we have the EU Parliament, we have the EU Commission, which is the executive branch, basically. So we don't have one, like Ursula von der Leyen is not our queen or president, but she's the head of the Commission, and she has her commissionaries, and then you have the European judicial system, the court, and so on. And then there are a few other like weird institutions that are partly part of the executive branch. So there's I think it's called the Council of Europe. And this is very confusing. There's like an EU Council, and there's a Council of Europe. And then I think there's a Council of the EU. And honestly, I can't remember which one is which. But basically works like this, that the EU, the people of Europe, of the individual citizens in all the countries that are in the EU, they every 5 years, I think, they vote for a couple of people, depending on the size of the country, to represent them in the EU Parliament. There are I think 700 people or something, parliamentarians in the EU Parliament. They coalesce into different party groups that somewhat aligned with the parties that they represent in their home countries. And so you sort of have the very left-wing parties, the Social Democrats, the sort of center, the Greens. You have the center-right moderate parties, the conservative Christian Democrats, right-wing, and then further to the right, depending on how you see it, the very sort of anti-European parties who are still in the European Union, ironically. And they vote on legislation that is proposed by the European Commission in most cases. So the European Commission actually proposes new legislation. The Parliament votes on it, basically, and then it goes back to the Commission, and they ratify it, or whatever it is the word there. And then I think the judicial branch, the court, can sort of decide whether this is legal or not. So there's this final check. So it goes around like that. So it's, in many ways, it's a very technocratic kind of, it's a smart system in many ways, actually, I think, in terms of how the institutions are set up, but it is a little bit confusing. So, on the one hand, you can think that maybe we want to strengthen this system to make it more effective. So when people go to vote for parliamentarians in the EU, the voter turnout is very low. If I think in Sweden, maybe 80-90% or something of people vote in our parliamentary elections to decide who's going to run the country and to create a government. And in the EU elections, it's like maybe 30-40% or something of people who vote. So people generally don't care that much because it's further away, and that, that kind of makes sense. But it's sort of this sort of technocratic, bureaucratic thing that is the EU is so it doesn't have a persona to people. They don't really feel a part of it, at least not most people. So one way of approaching this is like, can we actually make people care more and make it so that actually, I'm not just like choosing one person who goes and sit in the EU Parliament, and maybe they have said that they want to get this or that law passed, or they're more pro environment, or they're more pro anti-immigration or whatever. But that person is not going to be able to do a lot in this really big, hairy bureaucracy. So maybe one way is to try to give more power to, at least the feeling of more power to the people that vote, and to see change in the EU. The other way that you can go is to basically figure out the ways in which the EU countries can cooperate tightly across, for example, economic matters, or maybe even like military matters, but otherwise not have these binding declarations and laws and rules. So sort of like make the cooperation much more specific and less broad and less general. And then there are pros and cons with both. I think this kind of comes back to, how do you feel about the federalist route versus, I want my country to be independent.
Yeah, the other aspect to this, we're broaching the subject of military, is in America we had a civil war, and prior to that civil war, I'll just say after the fact of the Civil War, what we would consider to be the Southern states, so the Confederate states that participated, they became solidly Democratic. And then they flipped, and now they're solidly Republican. But basically, they vote as a bloc, with a few exceptions. But for the most part, they vote as a bloc. And there is a concept of a Southern identity that is distinct, and it's it's more powerful than any other of these in terms of, obviously there are racial divisions in America. But putting those aside, just in terms of regional cultural identity, something that you could theoretically assimilate into, there's not as much of a powerful like Northern identity or Western identity. Maybe those exist to some degree, but not as strong as the Southern identity. It has its own accent, its own history, its own culture. And I think that if you look before the Civil War, that actually wasn't as powerful. That they didn't think of themselves so much as a bloc. And so I guess what I'm suggesting here, if we're talking about different mechanisms by which Europeans could become more unified, we're talking about legal avenues and election reform or regulatory reform. But then another one has to do with this concept of a European army, and not to encourage or advocate for war, but just maybe to say as a point of fact, for good or evil, if Europe was engaged in a large-scale war similar to the American Civil War, I would expect that the aftermath of that, even if Europe lost the war, because the South did lose the Civil War, but they still developed out of that war a sense of common identity. We're all Southerners. We vote as a bloc. We have a common culture. We have a common way of life. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that win or lose, if Europe was able to engage in a continental scale war in the same way that America had a continental war with the Civil War, that this would, on a cultural level, probably encourage integration. Now, again, to advocate for that is not really safe to do, because there's a lot of risks with war, right? If our goal is ultimately to improve the economy, war might be a bad way to do that. There could be, look at World War I, look at World War II, and in fact, that's why to an extent, you could almost say that those wars created the European Union. They justify the European Union because they say, well, we don't want to have another war. That's why we have the European Union. But I guess the problem with World War I and World War II is that those were wars between different European states, and so they didn't actually create. And in a sense, it's the opposite. It's because we fought the war between each other that we now have to unify. And the other irony of it is that whereas in the Civil War it was the North that won, so it was these large northern urban cities like Boston, New York City, Baltimore was kind of wanted to join the Confederacy, but Washington, D.C. So you had these big cities in the North that came to define America in terms of its political capital in Washington, D.C., but also its financial capital in New York City and its intellectual capital with Harvard and Yale, these northern universities. There are some southern universities. I think Auburn is pretty good, but still, the concept of the Ivy League is rooted in the Northeast. So the North won, and then the North became culturally dominant. Before we had Hollywood, the film industry actually got started in New York City. A lot of radio got started in the North. So culturally, media, all of that started. So what I'm saying is that the North won the war, and then it became the dominant cultural, media, intellectual, financial power. Whereas in World War I and World War II, Germany lost both of those wars, and yet it still is in a position economically to be at the center, to be leading the EU. So there's almost like a mythological or a narrative contradiction there, where the effective leader of the EU, the center of the EU, is also the loser of the two world wars that justify the EU. So there's a bit of and then, talking about English as the lingua franca, I agree that's, logical given the current context we live in, but maybe from a cultural identity standpoint, that's a difficult pill for people to swallow. Maybe not. I mean, they probably would prefer to speak English rather than German, for example, again, for those historical reasons. But these are contradictions. These are difficulties that Europe is dealing with on a cultural or mythological level that America has had an easier time. Like if the South won the Civil War or something, and then but somehow we got back together in a union, that would make I think integration more problematic, because people don't know this, but actually the South, it wasn't just slavery. It was primarily slavery, but there were also concerns over free trade and tariffs and economic policy that if the North didn't crush the South, those sort of disagreements would have persisted to this day. And that's part of the reason why the southern states are still poorer than northern states, is because their economy benefited greatly from protectionism, and by freeing up international markets, the South lost a lot from that. And so maybe you can go off that we're not advocating for warfare here. But I mean, this topic is more relevant than ever before because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So are you, maybe we don't have to have an actual full-scale war, but is the threat of war itself, maybe does it, as much as it's a tragedy, does it also present opportunities for European integration?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're already seeing that after Russia or Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, he probably expected Europe and the US to an extent to not do very much about it, like they hadn't done in the previous sort of invasion of the Donbass and Crimea and Georgia. But there was some kind of red line that I think was crossed when he did that, and it woke them up. And I mean, Europe is now many countries, the countries who are a part of NATO, are spending, close or above the 2% recommendation that the NATO countries should spend as part of their GDP. Poland, I think, spends like 4 or 5% of their GDP. So it's becoming one of the strongest armies in Europe, at least, given its size. Um, uh, so yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is I think this was the thing that pushed a lot of European countries to take their own defense very seriously. There is a lot of talk about closer cooperation across the EU and across Europe more broadly in military terms, both in terms of actual military cooperation, integrating personnel, integrating recruitment, and sort of like some people want to build a Euro army. But then there's also the kind of industrial military capacity part of it in terms of Europe has I would say, like a world-class military industry, arms industry. Sweden is actually one of the most prominent in the world, especially given its size in terms of arms exports. The thing is, like, there are 8 different battle tanks produced across Europe in different countries, and all kinds of different systems. The French is a really big arms producer as well, and certainly the Germans too. So there's this sort of like big mix of different initiatives. There are initiatives across European countries, like the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is like a French German thing. They created this jet fighter plane a decade or two ago. But there's certainly no cooperation, I think. And the bigger, so on the tech side, my point is that on the tech side, European arms industry is quite advanced. In many ways, probably as advanced as the US, at least in certain areas, if not more advanced. The Europeans' problem is that they lack the capacity to produce a lot of armaments, a lot of guns, a lot of artillery shells, right? And that's becoming very apparent now when they realize that to actually fund a war or to win a war, you have to keep producing. And I mean, the US has the same issues, right? We kind of like decommissioned a lot of the plants and a lot of the knowledge and capacity to do those kinds of things. And one of the reasons I think Russia is still able to do relatively well or to keep fighting is because they basically bet their whole economy on just producing artillery shells and keeping the fight going. So in any case, I think that realization has really struck people quite hard. I think definitely regular people, but across the EU establishment and all of the nations there. So there is movement happening, but you're also right that the EU was founded as a result of the Second World War in many cases, in many ways, or it was the coal and steel union between France and Germany to integrate their economies and make sure that they couldn't really go to war anymore. And then that evolved into the European Union over several decades. And then there are many ways for the Europeans to integrate their militaries. So you could have, on the one end of the spectrum, you could have an actual European military where, instead of being drafted into the Swedish armed forces, I would be drafted into the European armed forces, which are made up of all of these member countries. I think that's very unlikely to happen anytime soon, if ever. It would basically be the same thing as creating a federation, the European Federation. You could have more like voluntary cooperation. There have been these European battle groups, which I think still exist, where countries commission part of their armies and personnel into sort of groups of um, European battle groups is what they were called, that can be called into various conflict areas or respond to conflicts and train together. And then, if something happens, there is patches of cooperation and coordination. But honestly, I think, given where we are now in terms of security from the European perspective, it's probably better to just double down on increasing funding nationally, maybe cooperate on building and creating and producing armaments and technology together, because you want to pool the R&D to get more bang for your buck. So that would be one thing. And then the second thing is to work more together with NATO. I think NATO is the good framework for military cooperation today, at least. And obviously, you have the US there as the pillar of NATO, at least for the next 2 months.
Well, you've got until January 20th.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah.
you've got 3 or 4 months. So the 2 words that I'm hearing is industry and energy. So when we're talking about why can't Europe just convert cash into armaments? Why is this slow? Why are there these delays? Why are there shortages? One answer is that these are energetically demanding processes, and Europe has, I don't know if it's an energy crisis or shortage, but it doesn't have an energy surplus. Like Russia has an energy surplus. It has all the energy that it needs to fuel its armament production. America theoretically has an energy surplus, although we hold a lot of our energy in reserve. Sometimes that's justified for environmentalism. China does not have an energy surplus. It has to import. But what it does have is it has essentially a protectionist, or, well, whether it's actively protectionist or whether it's just de facto a result of the fact that traditionally Chinese labor has been cheaper than foreign labor. So there's no incentive for Chinese firms to outsource and to build factories overseas. Now, that may be changing because, the average wage in China, or the GDP per capita, is coming close to 13,000 per year. And actually there are other countries in Europe, like Nepal, or countries in Africa, where Chinese companies may eventually begin to outsource, as this Chinese middle class is basically developing more technical skills, more service-oriented skills. They're going into programming, they're going into engineering. And so that kind of low-level factory work is actually not as cheap in China today as it used to be 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So I guess then the question is, well, for a long time, I think people were hoping, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russia could have some sort of reciprocal relationship with Europe, where Russia provides the energy, Europe provides the R&D, and this resolves both countries' problems, because Russia it lags behind in certain levels of development, but it has energy. Europe is very developed, but it doesn't have energy. And so that relationship would have been ideal. That was the basis behind the Nord Stream pipeline. Of course, now you have a political issue, which is that Russia is not willing to abide by international agreements. It's not willing to respect sovereign borders. And so as a result, that seems to be, it seems like that's not very likely in the near future, especially with Vladimir Putin in charge. So as long as he's in charge, I don't see that issue being resolved. And so, the United States has tried to step in with these liquid natural gas shipments to Europe, trying to help alleviate the energy concerns. I also know that Norway plays a big role in the North Sea in providing energy to Europe. I think Romania, to an extent, has some oil. Are there any other possible. I mean, something really crazy and far out. Maybe this is just an example of going too far. But there actually are. If you look at a map of Antarctica, we consider Antarctica to be like neutral, like the moon or something. But actually, there are these claims that in Norway, the United Kingdom, Australia, these countries actually do have claims on Antarctica. Now, there are international treaties that ban any kind of resource acquisition. But we have proven that there are reserves of oil and coal and things like that. So maybe that's a bit, I don't know, hyperbolic. I'll use that term. But it should, in your opinion, Europe's energy problems, are they best resolved, or do you think the easiest way for them to be resolved would eventually, I guess option one would be like somehow end the war in Ukraine in an agreeable way and then go back to receiving oil from Russia? That would be kind of maybe the default traditional option. And then you would have something like develop greater energy infrastructure with America, maybe some kind of pipeline that goes from Canada to Greenland, Iceland to the mainland or something like that. Or option C would be Europe, independent of Russia and independent of America, is able to form agreements with other third-party countries, say Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or something, and develop infrastructure, with those sort of countries that are currently, I would assume, Saudi Arabia has a very close relationship with the United States, and so there might be some difficulty there. I mean, or do you think it's sort of a combination of all three, or two out of the three? Where do you think Europe should go for its energy? Or I guess the fourth option I didn't talk about is green power, nuclear power, all of those things as well.
Yeah. All of the above. I'm not an energy snob. I think we should take our energy where we can get it, maybe outside of burning wood and coal. It's interesting. This is one of the key points that Mario Draghi, who was the former head of the ECB, the European Central Bank, he just released this big report to the European Commission, where he actually brings up a lot of the problems that I discussed in my article and that we've been talking about today. And one of the things is that energy has become, but I think even before the war, was too expensive in Europe generally. And Europe has, outside of the military, but a lot of other very energy intensive industries. There's a lot of like old school companies doing, creating like steel, and a lot of chemical processes just require a lot of energy, not to mention just the general fact that energy abundance and the availability of affordable energy is one of the key components to creating economic growth and wealth and all of those things in the long term. I'm sure you've seen some of these charts of like energy, energy production and however it's measured, and like GDP, and it all goes up to the right. So that's super important. I think a lot of especially the hardcore environmentalists, and the impact that ideology has had on Europe, I think on the world, on the US as well, has been unfortunately maybe more detrimental than it's been good. I think it's good that we've been pushing very hard to create other sources of renewable energy, like solar and wind. It's very unfortunate that we haven't invested more in nuclear power, or that we stopped investing in nuclear power. It's completely idiotic that Germany has shut down, especially in the face of being the biggest importer of gas, that they shut down their nuclear power plants. I think as many countries as possible should continue to invest in the nuclear power that they have, to build more. Sweden is basically energy independent. We have a lot of hydropower and some nuclear power, and wind and a few other things, but it's basically like 98% or something. It's carbon free. And I think France gets like 70% of their energy from nuclear power. too. So it is Germany and a few other countries that aren't energy independent and probably won't be. And I think actually that's probably one of the things that Europe and the EU can be very good for, is to uh, collaborate on technologies and invest in projects. Why not create like a pan-European nuclear energy project? There are actually nuclear fusion energy projects that are happening in Europe, in European universities. But I don't think we should just go like, oh, it needs to be completely zero carbon. There's like no world in which this is a realistic alternative outside of completely degrowing the economy. That doesn't mean we need to build more coal plants. I think we should be doing like really good trade deals with the US to import a lot of liquid natural gas. There is a lot of, I think, natural gas in Ukraine actually as well. So there are other sources for that energy too. But it's probably one of the most important things that Europe can do outside of just the security question, is to ensure that there is cheap and abundant energy. And at least it looks like more people are talking about that right now. So that gives me some hope.
Yeah, one of the issues I have with nuclear power has to do with security. And, I haven't yet heard kind of the rebuttal to this. But of course, it's possible if you have a coal plant or you have, Norway does this offshore oil drilling, oil platforms, like all of any sort of energy production or distribution, right? The Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. So obviously, traditional sources of energy are sensitive to military attack and sabotage and terrorism. But I guess one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to embrace nuclear in the way maybe in the past that I think it's appropriate, or I think in America or Switzerland, in a case where you're not necessarily worried about that, I think it makes more sense. But I'm worried that nuclear is very centralized. So during the Second World War and also wars in the Middle East, there's a lot of we've seen actually how resilient oil is. You can bomb an oil field, you can set it on fire, you can hit it with everything you have, but it's actually very difficult to cause long-term damage because the source of energy is not technical. The extraction is technical, but the source of energy itself has already been created. It's underground, and it's difficult to eliminate that source of energy. And so once you have that source of energy, and also in terms of transportation, it is possible, obviously, optimally, you would have a pipeline. But if you have a source of energy, you can, like the United States is doing, you can transfer it on a ship. You can turn it into liquid natural gas and you can transfer it on a ship and you can sail it across the ocean. When it comes to nuclear power, my issue is that when we're talking about jets, when we're talking about tanks, when we're talking about trucks, I'm not saying it's theoretically impossible to create like a battery that can power a tank or a battery that can power a jet, or maybe put a small, like we have nuclear subs, maybe we could have nuclear jets, we could have nuclear tanks and so on. So I'm not saying that it's theoretically impossible, but I'm saying that if you completely rely upon green energy, solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, you're creating an issue where that might work when you're hooked up to an electrical grid and you're just doing industrial processes, but it's difficult to fuel and energize a military. And maybe I'm too traditional in this respect. Like obviously World War III is not going to be fought like World War II. So, just saying like, okay, well, you need, you obviously needed oil in World War II. You couldn't fuel tanks and planes with batteries in World War II. So maybe that will change in the future. But currently where we are, I haven't seen that technology proven. And that's why I'm a little more sympathetic. I don't think that decommissioning was the right move, but I also think that people who say, well, we should just go 100% nuclear, that's something I'm a little bit hesitant about. And so I guess I would agree with the idea of diverse sources of energy. In fact, the more sources of energy you have, the less fragile it is. And if one system
Yeah.
breaks, you can switch to another system and so on. But we are coming, I have a lot more I'd like to speak with you about, and I hope we can do a follow up conversation. I have gone a little bit over my time here, but I want to give you the last word, closing statements, and tell people, what you're working on and what you think they should be reading.
Certainly. Well, just final statement on that. I think energy diversity is really important for security reasons and other reasons. I mean, I'm sure there's a healthy mix of a lot of or some amount of nuclear power as like a base power for the electricity grid, combined with patches of solar and wind and in various mixes depending on the geography and all of those things. And obviously, oil or liquid forms of energy are going to play a big role in the foreseeable future. Not to mention, just to drive tanks and planes. So I'm not disputing that at all. I guess I would just be more pro nuclear generally than I think than what I suspect most people have been. But that aside, yeah, I write on Substack. I publish. I try to publish monthly, but I usually end up publishing quarterly or so now. There's not a lot of time to write. This is just my hobby basically. I love learning and reading about technology and progress. I read about politics and philosophy. I don't write that much about it. And yeah, so I mean, you should check out my Substack. That's a good place to start.
Awesome. Okay, well, I appreciate it. There's a lot I wanted to talk about, reindustrialization and the role of China and much
Yeah,
bigger geopolitical issues, but we've run out of time, so I will hopefully follow up with you soon. And by soon, I mean in time scale of maybe that sounds like a few months, but I'm sure some things will happen and we'll have some more to talk about. But in any case,
certainly. Yeah,
Philip, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we can speak again soon.
yeah. Well, let's do it again. Good talking.
All right, take care now. Bye bye.
Bye.
All right, it was a good one. I do have to run. Like the post, comment on the post, restack the post, share the post. I'm going to come up with a song for you guys to do that. But yeah, that was excellent. Really enjoyed it. Would love to do it again. We didn't explore. I wanted to talk about outsourcing. Specifics of migration policy. The attitude towards China. The European Union is one of China's biggest trade partners. Should that change? What should be the policy there? So anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching or listening, and I will see you guys next time.